Hello, everybody. You're listening to Angel Nears, the podcast. Angel Nears is a Silicon Valley community for startup builders where experienced operators share their firsthand knowledge on how to build and scale startups. I'm your host, Oleg Kujikov, and our guest today is Dmitry Rokhfeld. He's the co-founder and CEO at Machinio, a search engine for buying and selling new and used industrial equipment and machinery that is trusted by millions of global users. Since its founding, Machinio has continued to revolutionize the way buyers and sellers operate by introducing new technology and saving both sides substantial time and effort. Machinio's standout growth and success led to its acquisition by Liquidity Services in July of 2018. We're here to talk about Dmitry's experiences of starting, building, and selling Machinio. But before we get into that, Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, real excited to talk today. Why don't you just start us off telling us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? How did you get started in this business?
Sure. My name is Dmitry, as you mentioned. So we founded the business in end of 2012 and 2013. And the truth is, we kind of stumbled on this idea. My co-founder, and he was the chief technology officer of Machinio. His name was Dan Pinto. He came to me. He came to me with this idea in around 2012 when we were living in San Francisco. And randomly, back when he was still living in Chicago, he had a colleague of his ask Dan to find a used printing press online. And Dan, not being from the industry, was like, okay, I'll start at Google, just like, we typically start for finding anything that we want to purchase online. And in that process, after spending about 45 minutes and not being able to find this, used printing press that his friend had asked him to locate, he had his eureka moment and thought, these days we have so many vertical search engines that exist for just about every other industry. You have Indeed to find jobs, and you have Kayak to find flights and hotels. Why doesn't a similar platform exist for used machinery? And so that was kind of like the kernel of an idea, and he held that with him for some time. And then we were both living in San Francisco. He and I have known each other since middle school. So we grew up together in Miami and had dabbled in various internet based ventures for years and years, never full time, but just small projects that we were interested in, eBay stores and yeah, websites and blogs, etc. And we always knew that we wanted to focus, full time on a venture together, after college. And so we finally had this opportunity in 2012 where we had this idea. Now, like I mentioned, neither of us were from the used machinery industry. So early on, it was a lot of customer discovery, customer research, and really trying to understand whether this hypothesis that Dan had about this industry lacking a vertical search engine was in fact accurate. But after talking to a number of dealers and potential buyers in the industry, it turned out that was the case. Over the last 5 to 10 years, so much inventory had gone online, but at the same time, buyers were still finding and purchasing equipment in often similar ways that they were doing before. They had individual relationships with dealers, and there were a number of online classifieds that were used, but nothing to the extent that you see in other industries like cars and jobs and flights and hotels. And so that was really kind of the impetus for the idea. And so then we just started working on it together.
That's awesome. I have a little bit out of the bag question here. You said you kind of had this idea, kind of passionate about it. It sounds like you were really passionate about, your partner who you were working with. Would you say that which would you say was more important, the idea for the business or the partner that you started it with?
I mean, for me, I really do think it's the partner. Having grown Machinio and also having spoken to a lot of other founders and entrepreneurs, both who have worked with other founders and some that have started companies on their own. The early team is critical. Really, at the end of the day, execution is the difference between a successful startup and not. In addition to that timing and other factors. But I think for us, having this 10 plus year foundation of friendship was very, very valuable because at the end of the day, anytime we encountered an obstacle and a hardship, and of course we encountered our fair share, just like any startup, knowing that the person on the other line, is not an adversary in any way, it's somebody that I've known for a long time, you know, that provided both of us definitely kind of a sense of relief and comfort, because no matter how difficult things were, we knew that we had this partner next to us that was there for us. And I think he helped me maybe when I was down, and I helped him when he was down, and we really kind of helped keep each other motivated, and ready to kind of keep tackling on the problems. So for me, I thought this was true before we started Machinio, and I think it's that much more true now, having worked with him for 7 years. The early team, and especially the co-founder that maybe you start a company with, is more critical than even the idea. And that's something that both of us were really fortunate to have from the beginning. Somebody that we had known. We didn't really have to develop a relationship over the time that we were working together. We already had that solid foundation going in, and I believe it really helped us along the way.
Well, yeah, that's awesome to hear. Thanks for answering that one. That one wasn't quite in the show notes, but I just thought it'd be interesting. And it doesn't have hurt to have a good idea too. And it sounds like you guys had a good idea. So you've kind of given us the sort of seed idea. What was the impetus behind the decision? You've also kind of talked about a little bit of your exploratory market research. You looked at the market. What's your addressable market? It looks good. It looks like there's a real opportunity here. Can you tell me, like, can you unpack exactly what Machinio does today? Is it the same thing? Is it the same kind of concept that you had 7 years ago? Has it, all startups kind of grow and pivot, so I'm sure it's not exactly the same. But yeah, does it kind of work how you had envisioned? What do you have here today?
Sure, yeah, it does in large part. So the core concept from day one, in which you described at the start of the show, was building a search engine for used machinery. So what we noticed in the beginning was this information discovery problem. Now, a lot of this equipment had come online over a period of 5 to 10 years. There were many websites that were started by dealers and brokers and other suppliers of used machinery, but no one had really come in and tried to aggregate all of that together. And as a result, if you're interested in finding a used machine online, you might start a Google, just like Dan did in his early attempt. But then you might spend hours, days, weeks navigating through hundreds, thousands of different websites before you find what you're looking for. Or maybe even if you find it sooner, you don't necessarily find the best price for it. So that was really the pain point that we noticed from the beginning, and that's what we tried to solve. And the way that we tried to solve it was simply just aggregating all of this inventory from thousands of different websites, so that as a potential consumer, you could visit one website and filter for exactly what you're looking for, and not have to spend days, weeks, months of visiting many individual websites. And so that was kind of the core product, and that's something that we really focused on from day one all the way through day 7 year. Over time, it was a lot more of becoming more and more comprehensive. So in the beginning, we had hundreds of thousands of individual listings. Towards the end, we had millions. It was also, I guess, growing the number of verticals that we were in. So while we definitely try to be fairly kind of industry agnostic from the beginning, where we try to assist people looking for agricultural equipment, construction equipment, transportation, machine tooling, woodworking, processing, packaging. So we did try to kind of be quite broad from the beginning, but over time we tried to get deeper and deeper into each of these verticals, and at the same time continue growing. I think semiconductor equipment and laboratory equipment were a couple others that we ended up adding kind of years down the line. But it very much was about trying to find every single used machine online, so that you knew as a buyer, if you came to Machinio, you basically had in front of you every single available machine that was for purchase on any website. So that was kind of the core idea, and that's something that we focused on, from day one all the way through 7 years in. I think our monetization model, that's something that we kind of experimented a lot over time to really figure out what worked. So in fact, early on, we started with a transaction model where we had these informal based commission relationships with dealers where they would pay us when one of our leads resulted in a successful sale. But over time, we realized that to make that model work, you really had to police it and you really had to ensure that the entire transaction happened on the platform. And as a very kind of small company, we realized that that was a challenge in and of itself, and would distract us from trying to be the most comprehensive platform. And that was really the goal. And so we moved away from that monetization model and then became much more of a subscription based business where dealers would purchase an annual subscription, and in return their equipment would be listed on our platform, and then we would then drive interested buyers to them, where the transaction would happen off platform. So that was kind of like the core idea from the beginning and something we continued working on. I would say where we did end up, making additional, I guess, departures from that core idea happened in the last couple of years, where one of the problems that we saw in the industry, in addition to this information discovery problem, was the fact that a lot of these dealers just did not have the technical background to create great websites. And so as a result, if you weren't using if you weren't on Machinio, or if you were not advertising with one of our competitors, it was very, very unlikely that a buyer would ever find your equipment online by starting at Google. Your website was not optimized for search engines. It wasn't optimized for mobile. It was a very, very poor user experience. They didn't have even some of the marketing capabilities to reach out to some of their former contacts. And so we saw that there was an opportunity to leverage our technical experience, our background, in helping improve their digital presence, not only in helping list their equipment on our website, but even creating better websites for them so that they were not necessarily reliant on having to market as heavy on any digital marketplace. And so one of the new products that was launched in the last couple of years when I was there was a product called Machinery Host, and it was basically an inventory management and website capability for these dealers, so that they basically had the latest and greatest technology for themselves, which then enabled them to have a much stronger digital presence and enabled their websites to rank better at Google. It made it easier for them to, maintain their equipment on their site. It gave them, these marketing capabilities where they can alert, their buyers and former contacts when they had new equipment that came in. So that was, I think, one of the pain points. Like I mentioned, we noticed through our conversations with these dealers, and it became very obvious to us just by visiting their website how outdated some of these websites were. And it wasn't because these dealers didn't understand that they needed a better presence. It just stemmed from the fact that they didn't know how to get that presence. And because we already had relationships with thousands and thousands of these dealers who trusted us to be their kind of the digital player, who trusted our tech background, it became kind of a natural extension of the marketing exposure we were providing them to offer them this technology platform for themselves. And that product has been going really well over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So we kind of have a chance here. Would you like to speak a little bit more about the platform product, or do you want to move to kind of the competition here?
I think I covered it pretty well. Yeah, basically at a high level, it's giving dealers an opportunity to show off their equipment, show off their company in a better light than they had with either their outdated website, or in some cases we had dealers that had no website at all. And so in the most basic level, it was creating a website for them that was mobile friendly, that was search engine friendly, where it was a very seamless process to add and maintain and update the equipment, and also made it very, very easy for them to kind of work with us and other players to kind of export that equipment on various marketing platforms that they might use. And over time it was adding other capabilities that they were looking for example, more readily able to market to their contacts when they did have additional equipment available.
Yeah, so it's basically strapping the little guy up with enough technical know-how, enough tools to basically create a footprint in the digital world that usually those small players haven't been able to do traditionally. Next, I want to ask about your key differentiation. You mentioned you have competition in this space. Can you speak about your competition and tell me what differentiates you from your competition? What is your secret sauce as a company?
We definitely had a number of competitors when we started. They were all basically classified. So they were traditional, offline classifieds that ended up moving online. But very much the model was the same. They charged for advertising, and they enabled individuals who visit those classifieds to get access to more equipment than they would in any individual website. Where I believe we really set ourselves apart was in making the process for dealers as easy and seamless as possible. So, for example, one of the biggest pain points that dealers experience as far as working with classifieds and even in their own website is the amount of time it takes to maintain their equipment on these various platforms. Basically, you have to manually kind of go in on a daily or weekly basis, add the new equipment that you now have available, remove anything that's been sold. And because it is very time consuming, dealers often end up not doing it or doing it very, very rarely. And so, one of the problems that you do experience with some of these other marketing platforms is the fact that a lot of the equipment is outdated. And so, as a buyer, you might go to one of our competitors and find like the perfect machine for you at the right price and the right location. You end up contacting the dealer, and then the dealer tells you, well, that was actually sold 2 weeks ago or 2 months. Sorry, I didn't, I forgot to update it. Or maybe they'll blame the classified themselves and say, well, we did update it, and it's just that they haven't they haven't kind of processed some of the updates. And so we realized early on that as a new company, any opportunities we have to remove friction, that can really help us differentiate ourselves apart. And so that's one of the reasons why we decided to leverage technology in a way none of our competitors did. With all of our competitors, the dealer has to manually kind of go in and log in and maintain that equipment. In our case, we aggregate that equipment directly from their website without requiring them to do just about anything. And so that saved them a tremendous amount of time, because they had the confidence that as long as they maintained their own website, which for the most part they were pretty good at doing, like if they were going to update a single point of reference for their equipment, it would be their own website. And so by visiting their website directly, using crawler spiders, and ensuring that our database matches what's on their website, we both ensured that our platform was kind of more up to date and more accurate in real time than any of our competitors. And that was also a huge selling point for the dealers, because when we worked with them, there was no additional time commitment on their end. They knew that as long as they maintained their own website, then our website would be accurate as well. So that was kind of the big differentiator from the dealer standpoint. And at the same time, like I referenced, from the buyer standpoint, by us being really, really comprehensive in terms of the equipment that we showed buyers, that started differentiating us from a lot of our competitors who were not leveraging technology to crawl the web. And so as a result, a lot of their platforms were not as comprehensive. And so I think those two pieces is a good example of how we leverage technology to make the process easier for buyers, because they knew that if they found something on our site, odds are that that piece of equipment actually existed. And that's how we also made it easier for dealers, because we removed friction from the dealer having to do any work to kind of maintain that equipment on any of the marketing platforms that they worked with. At the same time, I'll be honest to say, we had and still do have a number of formidable competitors where their big advantage over ours is the fact that they've been in the industry for 20 years, both initially as an offline publication and over time as a joint kind of online and offline publication. So that's pretty much one of the reasons why we had to leverage technology in this way, because we had to kind of overcome the fact that a lot of clients did not know who we were, and so had some reservations. And I would say that's also an area where initially kind of Ritchie Brothers, and then eventually Liquidity Services kind of helped us because in both cases, the Series A kind of validated the model and put kind of a well-known brand behind Machinio. And eventually, when Liquidity Services acquired us, that put another very kind of well-known and respected brand behind Machinio, and that really helped get especially dealers comfortable with working with us because it was much easier to say, you've heard of these brands, they believe in what Machinio is doing. Before we had that, it was a little bit more challenging because all we could say is, we work with a couple of dealers. Have you heard of them? No. Well, trust us. And so I think that's a good area where having strong partners, either as investors or as acquirers, can really help scale the business. And we're very fortunate to have both from our in our investing rounds and also afterwards, a number of strong partners that gave us the validation that we lacked in an industry where you know people are quite wary of what they haven't heard of. The used machinery industry, like I mentioned at the start, is an industry that's been very slow to move online relative to many others. And there's still, I would say, some distrust of technology, some distrust of you know platforms that you're not as comfortable with, that you haven't used before, that you don't know 30 other dealers are using. And so by having some of those partners, that helped us overcome some of those initial objections and continue growing.
Thanks for breaking that down. It's really interesting to hear kind of how you approached creating your platform, creating your tools. It sounds like you had a really user driven methodology there. And yeah, it's kind of funny. You're selling software to people who kind of sell or sell repurposed hardware. I imagine there's probably a lot of moral conflicts there in the mind. Next, let's go to kind of talking about the founding team at Machinio. When you're building a founding team, you want to align the three R's. Those are, the relationships in the team, the roles, and the rewards for doing your work. So let's start with roles. How did you handle assigning roles and positions among the founders?
For us, because Dan, my co-founder, was much more technical and in fact coded the first version of Machinio, it was a natural extension to have him, lead the technical effort. And so that's one of the reasons he became the chief technology officer. And as a result, I became everything else. And so I became the CEO. In practice, however, we really ran the company as co-CEOs, which is something you've seen some companies do, but it's still not as common. I believe for us that really helped us because before either of us embarked on any new initiative, within our domain. So for me, my domain was operations, sales, customer service, and for Dan, his domain was basically the product. Before we encounter or before we embarked on any new initiative, it was kind of the hurdle that we had to overcome was to convince the other party that it was a worthwhile effort. In some cases, as a CEO, you make the decisions you think is right. In our case, both of us had to convince the other that it was a worthwhile initiative to take. And so that really helped, I believe, like streamline our decision making, because by having some barrier that you need to meet, it forced us to only focus on what we really thought was critical and not just pursue any initiative that maybe we thought was interesting but our co-founder might not. And so like I said, for us, we really ran it at the company as co-CEOs, and I was involved in product development, and Dan was involved in operations and sales. But as far as just like the high level roles, because of his technical background, he was the chief technology officer, and I was the chief executive officer.
Mhm. And then I'm sure the listeners are curious. Let's talk about rewards. How did you guys split the equity and the cash compensation?
Like in all aspects of our business, we try to make decisions that created the least amount of friction. And because we were both co-founders, because we were both involved from day one, the natural decision, the simple decision, the obvious decision for us was everything should be equal. So as far as kind of like equity, cash compensation from day one all the way through the last day that we worked at Machinio, we were completely equals, and that therefore that eliminated any issues from arising, and it kept things really simple for both of us.
Yep, I love it. Always good to keep things simple. As a founding team, when you were creating your minimum viable product, did the team have any missing skills to launch that you needed to go out and find?
So I would say sales was that's less of maybe the minimal viable product. As far as creating the minimal viable product, Dan did a fantastic job, and for him it was a lot of learning on the job. So in fact, he became an incredible developer while building Machinio, which is pretty impressive if you think about that. So I wouldn't say there was anything missing from a minimal viable product perspective. But while both of us had experience in building small websites, we had experience in strategy and operations through some of the previous occupations we held. We did not have sales experience, and that's an area that we really focused on as soon as the product had been launched, and as soon as we were driving these leads from buyers to dealers. It was trying to hire a sales team from the beginning that could really start developing the relationships with these dealers and can really teach us a lot about the industry that we didn't know. The only thing we really knew about the industry came from a few hundred conversations we had early on with the various parties, but that was really just the tip of the iceberg as far as everything we needed to know. And one of our earliest hires was a man by the name of Steve Glod, who's still one of the core individuals at Machinio, and one of the individuals that are now managing the company. Given that myself and the other co-founder are no longer involved, and he really helped us learn everything that we didn't know about the industry. And there were a lot of things that we didn't know going in, how it really is an industry built on relationships. And if you have those relationships with dealers, it's easy to grow. And if you don't have those relationships to dealers, it's going to be very, very hard to convince individuals to give you opportunity, to give your product a chance. And once he discovered that and relayed that to us, that's actually when we started investing a lot more resources by becoming a larger part of the used machinery community, being involved in a number of associations, going to a lot of these dealership events, and becoming seen as really like an industry player and not just this like technical product that maybe you're getting some leads from, and you've heard of, but where you don't necessarily have like a face behind that product. And so that's an area that Steve really helped us with. And so I would say sales is probably the biggest area of weakness for our team, because neither Dan nor I had a tremendous amount of sales experience kind of going into building the product.
So I want to keep talking about those early hires. How long was it before you started making your first hires? And you already mentioned that sales was one of the first areas of expertise where you kind of needed to go find someone. Who else was part of that early stage hiring process?
So for us, I would say one of the areas that we probably didn't do a great job in the beginning was waiting a little bit too long to hire. Our goal was to try to be as lean as possible, and that remained from the beginning all the way to the end. But as a result, I think we weren't as quick as we should have been in delegating a lot of the responsibilities each of us had that could have been done by somebody else. And so that's probably an area where we weren't as productive early on as we could have been if we just hired a couple more individuals to help with even things like customer support that could be done by anybody. It doesn't need to be done by the CEO. And so there were a number of areas early on where we probably held on to these tasks longer than we should have, both because we were trying to conserve capital, also because we felt like we're best equipped to handle those jobs. But over time, I think it became quite obvious to us that the impact that the two co-founders can have is not on individual tasks that we complete, but in managing a really in first recruiting and hiring, and also managing a very effective team. So that's probably kind of an area of maybe a mistake we made early on that we ended up rectifying over time. But yeah, I would say sales was definitely kind of an area, and we started hiring salespeople within the first definitely within the first year, I would say between kind of the 6 month to a year period is when we started trying to hire the right salespeople, and it took us a couple of failed attempts before we landed on Steve. And the reason why we ended up focusing on that role in particular is because we already started creating these relationships between buyers and dealers, and so that's when we knew we needed to find the right monetization scheme, so we could start driving revenue on the platform, and that's a big area where Steve came in. Besides sales, it was just growing our technical team, since for a long time Dan basically created the MVP, was the designer for the company, and also created all of the individual crawling capabilities to kind of go out and aggregate all of this equipment. But that was not sustainable as we wanted to become more comprehensive, as we wanted to kind of go into new verticals. And so, yeah, expanding on our technical team was something else that we focused on within the first year.
And how did you expand that team? We're all probably listening to this podcast from the comfort of our homes. Did you hire remote team members? And then, if you did, what were some of the pros and cons of doing that?
That's actually an area where Oleg from Maxfield helped us. I believe he connected us with one of the first remote development shops that we ended up using. So for us, the decision to use remote developers came down to a few factors. Early on, we tried to hire developers both on the West Coast and East Coast, since we started the company on the West Coast, and then we went through an accelerator program in New York City before we ended up settling in Chicago. So we had experience trying to hire on the West Coast and East Coast, and we were not very successful. Part of it is because we didn't have the capital, to pay really, really high salaries. And as you might imagine, used machinery is not the sexiest of industry, and so you're not necessarily going to find people who are willing to maybe take a salary cut to work on something that they might be passionate about. And so we recognize that it would be very, very challenging for us to hire really, really strong technical talent if we only limited ourselves to people that would either reside in San Francisco or New York or eventually in Chicago. And at the same time, there are incredible talented developers and other employees, but in our case developers are what we needed all over the world. And we first got this experience by working with a kind of remote development shop. And the big benefits of that is, one, the cost. We were basically able to hire individuals at half a third of what you might pay in the United States, but also the quality of the work was far superior. So one of the things that Dan and I used to talk about is using remote developers, we're able to pay half for somebody twice as good. So there was a immense ROI in hiring remote individuals. It also allowed us to basically have like a 24/7 development cycle. I mean, we basically always had somebody working on the product, which is not maybe necessarily the case if you only have developers in your local time zone. But it was definitely something that worked for us from the beginning. And eventually we ended up not using these development shops, and just hiring directly to work for us. But at the same time, we continued employing both remote developers and eventually remote customer service people, remote QA people, because if you can do a really good job evaluating and making sure that the people who kind of come through the end of the hiring funnel are strong, you can end up having a really, really great team that is motivated, that doesn't necessarily cost you as much as they would in the United States. But then those individuals also get the benefit of being remote and being able to work on kind of their own time. And one of the, I think, biggest rewards that a lot of our remote employees experience is the fact that we allow them to kind of work their own hours in whichever location they wanted. And so they took the opportunity to travel all over the world while working for Machinio. And so it was I think a very positive experience for them, and also was a very positive experience for us. So much so that we continue trying to hire remote as much as we can.
Yeah, and a bit of a follow up. Remote work is what we're all doing today. Can you maybe speak to And it sounds like, maybe Dan was more in charge of managing those remote teams since he was the core product guy. But can you speak to how to successfully manage a remote team like that? How do you keep people motivated? How do you, make sure everybody's coming to work every day and putting in their best effort?
Yes, certainly that's one of the biggest challenge with remote individuals, especially if you don't want to constantly micromanage them. And so that's something that Dan tried very hard to do. Like Dan did not necessarily want to have a daily call with every single individual because that was time consuming and it's not necessarily kind of the environment that everybody necessarily wanted. And so I believe that the way that we structured it is by ensuring that every one of our individuals, both remote and also non-remote, were really aligned on a couple of like core KPIs or performance metrics. And what we saw, and this came from our investors' advice, what we saw is when individuals know kind of where their role, how it impacts kind of the broader success of the company, how their individual responsibility impacts one of the key KPIs, they end up being much more motivated than if they're working on something that is so far removed from the big picture that they can't kind of draw that connection. And so by constantly, I think, communicating and ensuring that each individual, no matter what level in the company, no matter what they were working on, how their individual role contributed to the broader success, I do think that enabled individuals to be much more motivated because they knew how critical their role was. And for us as a company that tried to be cash flow break even always, we didn't necessarily hire like excess roles. Like we only hired roles out of need, and so that also, I believe, helped ensure that people were both bought in to the company and also really understood that the only reason that they're around is because they serve a critical role for the company, not because we raise a ton of money and we're lavishly hiring all these roles that we may or may not need. It was the complete opposite, and it was really just hiring out of need.
Yep, that all makes sense. So next, you went through an accelerator program. Can you tell me about that, and was it a good experience?
We went through an accelerator program in New York City called the Entrepreneurs Roundtable Accelerator. I would say for us, it ended up being a very, very positive experience because while we had some background in product development and we already had an MVP that had traction, the areas that we really lacked and we had no idea even how to kind of enter the industry was as far as the fundraising part of growing a company. So we knew nothing about fundraising. We had no relationships with investors, the investment community. And so our ERA really helped us as an accelerator is they had relationships with hundreds and hundreds of investors that they very effectively leveraged in helping a lot of their companies kind of raise those early seed rounds. So it's through one of our investors in ERA that, for example, we found out about Maxfield and how that investment ended up being. It was through somebody that we met in ERA that we ended up getting introduced to the founder of Indeed, who became one of our really impactful investors. Because, like I mentioned, from day one we were really trying to become the Indeed of used machinery. And so I think that the benefit of accelerators like ERA is you can take from it what you need. I mean, there were a number of companies in our class that maybe weren't as far along in their product development, and that's where the incubator really helped them. For us, we had one source of need, and that was help us raise the early seed round when we don't know how to create a pitch deck. We don't know how to pitch somebody. We don't know, we have no ability to get warm introductions with these investors, and ERA had that both in the in the relationships that they had with their LPs, in the relationships that they had with other advisors that were actively looking at the types of companies coming ERA. And of course, you have these demo days at the end of the accelerator where you're able to get in front of a lot of members of the investment community. You're able to get great press, which we ended up doing, and further helps drive some of those fundraising conversations. So for us, it did come down to the fundraising effort that ERA helped us. And once we were able to get it right and learn how to raise money through ERA, that helped us, for example, when we were trying to raise our Series A.
And can you speak to your experience and how it was working with advisors? You're kind of starting a company. I'm sure you had lots of people that gave you advice. So yeah, what was your experience like working with advisors?
For us, we didn't really have kind of advisors outside of our investors, and even within our investors, I think we were very, very fortunate. All of our investors, I think, trusted the decision making of myself and Dan, trusted the direction the company was going, and were really there to help us when we needed help, but otherwise kind of enabled us the full freedom to act quickly, to explore, to change business models from commission based to subscription, for example, without necessarily having to convince them that was the right decision. And so I think for us, it helped us in various areas, but what was the most, I think, useful is none of our investors like forced us to make a certain decision, or made it very hard for us to make the quick decisions and to pursue the opportunities that we thought were worth pursuing. And so that's kind of how we leverage our community of investors, but we didn't necessarily have like a huge advisory committee at the company.
All right. Well, the company was very successful. I'm sure you picked and chose advice wisely. Let's talk about life before and after the acquisition. Can you just speak to that? What was it like before? What was it like after?
Yeah, so before, and this touches on the previous comment. Before, all of our investors, both from the seed round and also from our Series A, really trusted our decision making. And so while we had board meetings and we had monthly, sometimes less frequent calls just to update our investor community, they really allowed us to operate completely independently, and that really helped us. Having their trust and support really helped us pursue the opportunities that we thought were worth pursuing. And that was very, very important for us, to have that same sense of ownership over the company, and also that the same kind of support after the acquisition. So one of the conversation and one of the topics that we really spoke at lengths with the acquirer ahead of the closing of the acquisition, Liquidity Services Inc., was what would the ownership of Machinio look like afterwards, as far as the decision making, as far as the management, as far as the operations. And what was really important for us was that we continued being able to move quickly, and we continued being able to make the decision we thought without tremendous amount of oversight. Right? I don't think we had a tremendous amount of oversight, before the acquisition, and so it was important for us that with our acquirer, they did continue to treat us almost like a independent subsidiary. And part of the reason why that was really important is because our team was quite small. And you might be aware, one of the biggest mistakes that happen with acquisitions, especially when you acquire a small team, is by trying to integrate a small team and company in a much larger team. You often end up losing everything that makes that small company special, right? And so our acquirer recognized that it was very, very important to keep Machinio fairly separate and continue growing and continue moving along the really exciting trajectory that Machinio was on. And we recognized that the best way to ensure that Machinio continued hitting all of its milestones is for Dan and myself to continue being in charge, where we could leverage liquidity services where it made sense, and also where it didn't make sense, continue operating the company in much the same way as we did before. And so, we're lucky that's not the case for all companies that get acquired by a much larger entity. But liquidity services really did a great job at allowing us to continue operating. And the truth is, we ended up moving, instead of having monthly board meetings with our Series A investor, we ended up having monthly calls with the acquirer. But the day to day, if you didn't know that we were acquired, you would not have experienced any changes. And that was something that was really important to us. That was something that we stressed a lot to our team team, because obviously when an acquisition happens and people are nervous. What is going to change, or how is our day to day going to change? How's the direction of the company going to change? Like, will there be a lot more oversight? Will there be a lot more micromanagement? And so we assured them before the acquisition happened, like nothing would change from the day to day. Liquidity Services is acquiring this company because they're excited by the direction that we're on and the journey that we're taking. And the last thing they want is to derail us in any way. And that ended up being the case. We were able to continue operating the company in the same way as we did before. And that's why I believe Machinery has continued to be very, very successful, because Liquidity Services, has helped us when we needed help, but for the most part, allowed the management of Machinery to continue managing the company as it did before then.
Well, speaking with you for this amount of time, it's become clear to me you may have chalked it up to luck a little bit, but it sounds like you made a lot of really deliberate, important decisions to sort of get to that position of getting acquired, and frankly, a lot of entrepreneurs don't even get there. Most entrepreneurs don't get to sell their companies. So for all of us, you're kind of a minority among the majority there, because most entrepreneurs don't get to sell companies. So for those of us who have never sold a company, could you tell us some of the key lessons that you were able to learn just going through that experience and getting acquired?
Some of the key lessons of getting acquired. Ultimately, the easiest way to get acquired and to have a successful acquisition is, ensure that you have really good traction. It's obvious, but one of the reasons why we were successfully able to get acquired is because the company had been growing really, really, really well, and we had a clear path to continue that growth trajectory. And so by having that, I think our conversation with our acquirers, it was never out of need. It was out of kind of opportunity for us to leverage, the acquirer to grow faster, and opportunity for the acquirer to get a presence in an industry that they were looking to grow. But for us, I would say, the big thing, and I touched on this in the previous segment, was about ensuring from the beginning that we were aligned with the acquirer on the direction of the company. And that's pretty much where we spend the majority of our time in our conversations during kind of the negotiation. And it was really trying to understand, like, do we want the same things out of this, like, joint entity? And is what we're looking for, as far as a partner, what this company is looking to provide. And that's one of the reasons I believe the acquisition was very successful, not necessarily just from like a financial perspective, but in the aftermath of Machinery being able to continue growing, is because we were really aligned on what we wanted, and what the acquirer wanted as well. But like anything else, the more time you can spend researching the process, just like with investing, the more comfortable you are, the better you can do. We had like an M&A advisor that worked with us, that had worked with other companies and helped sell them in the past. And so we had that expertise kind of along with us for the ride as far as the acquisition went, that made the process a little bit less stressful, because we had somebody that knew what they were doing. Much the same way that I think early on, our incubator really helped us with fundraising, because we had a partner that kind of knew what they were doing, where we didn't. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but at least those are a couple of things that I think we that helped us along our acquisition track.
No, yeah, it was definitely good. So let's wrap this thing up. Dimitri, what are you up to these days?
At this time, so I have a 2-year-old at home, and so I'm in kind of the fortunate position of taking some time off when I step down from Machinio, and with COVID, it's really been about kind of taking care of him at home, which has been a incredibly kind of rewarding and fulfilling experience.
Awesome. Yeah. What's the next chapter for you?
I had an incredible experience with Machinio. It was, challenging, but some of the most fun I've ever had working, or in life in general, was working with my co-founder and building this company from 2 people to a peak of, I don't know, 70, 80. And so that's an experience that I would love to have again in the future. I think having done it once, I'm even more more passionate about doing it than before we started the first company. So certainly I would love another opportunity to start a company and incubate something that has impact in the industry. So hopefully I'll have another opportunity to do that in the future, but unlikely it'll be the case in the near term.
Well, it's a great company. You've certainly earned some time off. So, before we get out of here, can you just speak to the listeners? What's the best way if listeners have questions just to reach you, maybe ask questions themselves?
If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I don't have a very strong social media presence, so probably the best way would just be to contact me via email, which it's my first name Dmitriy, Dimitri, then the letter R at gmail.com. So if anyone's interested in getting in touch, I'm always interested in speaking with other founders and entrepreneurs, and if there's any opportunity where I can help, I would love to do so.
All right. Dimitri, we're going to end it there. If you liked our show, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and leave us a rating there as well. Thanks, Dimitri, for joining the show today. I appreciate your time. Let's try and get you back on here soon.
Sounds great. Well, thanks so much for having me.